Welcome to the original Governor's Mansion. My name is Bobby Harris and I'll be your host as we explore this stately Queen Anne home. It was built in 1888, a year before we became a state, so it wasn't intended to be the original Governor's Mansion back then. It was owned by Mr. William Chessman, who also owned the water company in town. That may have influenced his decision in putting a bathroom in the new house. It was quite the talk of the town back in Helena in those days. In 1913, the third owner had it on the market. It had a lot of improvements by then. It had electricity, new furnishings, and more bathrooms, since that did turn out to be a pretty good invention after all. In 1913, the state purchased the home to house our governors. Step inside with me and let's go explore the mansion. This is the waiting area where you would have left your calling card in 1888. Even the governor collected cards. His daughters remembered the parents, checking those calling card trays as we check telephone answering machines today. In 1913, our fifth governor and his family moved into the house. Samuel Vernon Stewart had 3 daughters that recalled the years that they spent in the home, especially the turbulent time in world history when the Great War broke out. Blue stars were hanging in people's windows to symbolize their soldiers that were fighting over there. As the girls walked through the neighborhood, they would salute the homes that had the stars prominently displayed. They also may have participated in gathering up items that the Red Cross let everyone know the soldiers needed. Things like tobacco, shaving equipment, sewing items, and stationery to write home. Letter writing was something the girls could help with, although Marjorie didn't do such a good job of it when she wrote to one of the neighbors.
Dear Harry, thank you for dying for our country.
He came back to tease her about that after the war because he didn't die for our country after all. In 1918, Governor Sam Stewart wrote,
"The women of the West are certainly doing their share in bearing the burdens of the war. We cannot be too eloquent in our praise of their efforts."
This is the drawing room where the First Lady received many guests, as well as the governor. Although he wasn't home too much during the war, he was pretty occupied over at the Capitol. The girls remember he often didn't get home till midnight. This is where the girls took piano lessons. The piano was not theirs, but it's very sentimental to the state of Montana. It was owned by Joseph Howard, a name very familiar in the old days. In 1910, he wrote our state song for us. And like many other composers, he turned his attention to writing war songs, like the song Somewhere in France Is a Lily, which we have out on the piano today. Joseph Howard was not a familiar name to many of us today, but back then, his big hit was on everyone's mind. It went, "Hello, my baby, hello, my honey, hello, my ragtime gal."
Hello, my baby, hello, my honey, hello, my ragtime gal. Send me a kiss by wire, honey, my heart's on fire.
While the girls were writing letters to the soldiers, many of us on the home front were eagerly reading letters that the soldiers had provided to us. The one on the table is from a soldier from Great Falls. It's been censored. See the little window where a name was cut out, lest the enemy spot something they didn't want known. Other songs, like We'll Do Our Share While You're Over There, highlights the help the women provided on the home front. Here we find the second of 7 fireplaces. Mr. Chessman ordered the tile from his home state of Massachusetts. Although the home uses steam heat as its main heat source, the coal-burning fireplaces added extra temperature control and a welcoming ambiance. The home's library is arranged with similar furnishings that appear in a 1915 photograph. An important feature was a bright light on a table that provided task lighting. On the table today are copies of government propaganda posters showing how the U.S. financed much of the war expenses, the Liberty Loan program. Not only were women and children used on the posters to sell bonds, but they often went door to door to ask for contributions. Some stamps were bought by children for just 25 cents. The governor's children remember counting out 25 pennies to paste the stamp in their books. While many Montanans enthusiastically supported this program, some communities used coercive tactics to pressure folks into buying war bonds. Newspapers, telegrams, and letters all give clues to the issues the governor was dealing with. There were Montanans who opposed the war for various reasons, from religious to political beliefs. There was also labor trouble across the state. When workers in Butte mines went on strike for better pay, safer working conditions, and being against providing copper for weapons, Governor Stewart called out the militia to force striking mine workers back to work. For protection against possible retaliation, the girls remember the militia standing guard around the mansion and even escorting the girls to school. The fireplace here has tiles the Chessman family ordered from England, and the fire set was here in the home when we purchased the mansion. It served all 9 governors here in the house until in 1959 they were moved over to the new mansion's fireplace. The dining room has the home's second owner's original furniture, custom built for this space around 1900. It looks as elegant today as it looked back then, but the girls confess they couldn't resist parking their wads of gum in the lions' open mouths on the back of their chairs. In 1959, the 9th governor to use this home moved into a new executive residence, which was built closer to the Capitol. The vacated house was used by state office workers. The leather walls were painted white and original chandeliers were removed so brighter office lights could be installed. During the home's restoration in the 1970s, this chandelier was given by Governor Ford's family. Governor Ford lived in the mansion during the Second World War. The effects of the war were felt quite strongly around the dinner table, especially by women. Even though Montana women won the right to vote in 1914, restrictive gender roles meant women were often the ones who cooked and took care of the home. With pressure from many World War I propaganda posters distributed by the Food Administration, women assumed the task of conserving food in order to send more supplies over there to feed soldiers, allies, and refugees. Come on into the kitchen. We'll go through the servants' pantry. To be self-reliant in feeding our families, we women were encouraged to raise our own food at home and at school. To preserve the food beyond harvest, victory canning clubs were set up. At Helena High, the boys in their shop class built a large food dehydrator we could all use. Montana's wheat and sugar beets were needed for soldiers and refugees, so our flour and sugar dispensers became empty as we did our bit for the war. Women in Hot Springs, Montana collected recipes to use alternative ingredients and meet the Food Administration's suggested rationing. They published this cookbook and dedicated it to the soldiers. The introduction reads, "Save the taste, control the waste, eat cornbread and rye, meatless days, wheatless days, eat less cream and pie. For our allies' sake, cut out the cake, save food and win or die. Keep fighters fit, this is our bid and that's the reason why." The ladies of the Hot Springs Red Cross put this book together. Mrs. Stewart had to learn how to bake her family's favorite dinner rolls with black flour. They were not well received. The last room on the main floor is the gentleman's enclave. I believe you may call it today the man cave. We found one of the original electric lights that was installed in this room around 1900, and it is once again helping the governor as he works on his speech to the legislature. As chairman for the Council of Defense, Governor Stewart called a special session that passed Montana's Sedition Act.
Fix it so that no longer may the enemy spies or the peddlers of sedition and slander go free in Montana. We are today either loyal citizens of this, our native or adopted land, or else we are traitors. The neutral or half-baked citizen in time of war is an impossible conception.
Under the Sedition Act, 75 Montanans were found guilty of treason and imprisoned for speaking out against the war and the government. The war was hard for German immigrants in Montana. We were at war with Germany, and the girls saw the derogatory nickname for Germans, Hun, all over the front page of the papers. They said calling someone a Hun was a sure way to start a fight. It was a little confusing why they were supposed to hate Germans. Their neighbor was German, and she was so nice and made the best donuts. But probably not during the war, because we were saving the fat, sugar, and flour.
Johnny Say, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run.
This room was originally the master bedroom in 1888, but was used by the First Lady in 1915 as a private sitting room where three little girls could relax and play without being disturbed by visitors downstairs. Or vice versa, not disturb the visitors downstairs who had come to call on their father, the governor. Governor Stewart brought home a similar portable Victrola from one of his trips out of state. A well-known World War I song is playing on it.
Over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the drums coming everywhere.
Over here, it was all hands on deck to knit the items the boys needed. Everyone was helping.
We will be very glad to quit our knitting when you boys come home.
They knit so much, some rewarded the popular war song, Over There. They started singing instead, over here, everywhere, we are knitting for the boys over there. Knit a sock or sweater, or even better, do your bit and knit a square. When you go across the hall into the girls' room, you'll see what they were doing with these small squares to keep the soldiers from freezing. The girls remember struggling to knit socks, but mostly they were knitting small squares of scrap yarn. They could be found on the front porch sipping lemonade after school and knitting away at these squares to keep the boys from freezing. The squares were then sewn into a blanket and then taken to the Red Cross office to be distributed.
Send the word over there. That's the Sammy's on.
Here we see the room the Stewarts reserved for company. It is the only bedroom in the mansion with its own bathroom, courtesy of the second owner converting the old dressing room. Imagine a soldier being invited to spend the night before he shipped out.
We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there, over there, over there.
The fabric on the walls was reproduced by a textile mill in Europe. They used the original faded fabric to replicate the pattern and colors. The bedroom set was also used in the house while the governors lived here. Emily, the oldest daughter, recalls using that stand mirror.
Being young ladies, we checked it frequently for our assets and defects.
This room was used by the Stewarts for their bedroom. Here we see some souvenirs that soldiers purchased overseas and sent home to their sweethearts. Some of the souvenirs were made by French and Belgian women who did their bit by making items to support their families in a war-torn Europe. In 1888, this was the only bathroom in the whole house. Over the years, it's been updated and modernized. When replacing the worn floorboards during the restoration in the 70s, scraps of old wallpaper were found. These scraps were used to reprint the paper you see here today. The last room on this floor is where the girls did homework. Marjorie would dress up in her mother's clothes to become Miss Beach, attorney at law, and write imaginary cases she was working on.
My dear Miss Beach, my son was a doctor and still is a doctor. He wants to go to war and we want him to go to France right away. Yours truly. Dear sir, the matter you spoke of can be fixed if he is 21. He can be put in a pretty safe place as a doctor. Write me about it. Miss Beach Lawyer. P.S. Pay tomorrow if it is all right.
While many mansions built in the late 1800s have full floor ballrooms on the top floor, the original owner, Mr. Chessman, preferred a smaller ballroom that he used as a billiards room, along with a small room for card playing. You'll see how the smaller rooms came in handy if a governor needed additional living spaces, and the Stewarts were one family that did. This room was used in 1888 for Mrs. Chessman's china painting workroom. It was a rather expensive hobby and many of her friends met here to paint with her. Today we see it being used by the First Lady's parents. The girls loved their grandparents living with them, but felt sorry for poor Grandpa coming up the steep stairs to his bedroom. He had a wooden leg from a train accident. As you see, everyone was helping to keep our boys dressed. On the bed are some examples of knitted items recreated by local Helena knitters using the original Red Cross instructions. Mrs. Stewart was often at the Red Cross office rolling bandages, and she could bring home yarn, patterns, and knitting needles the Red Cross gave out. This room, her sisters told us, was where Marge's dolls lived. The other half of the window is on the other side of the wall in the hallway, courtesy of the Queen Anne-era architects putting form over function. The two halves look great from the outside. The governor's sister, Sally, used this room every chance she got when she wasn't teaching school in Anaconda and Butte. The girls remembered what a good knitter and sewer she was. These talents were very much needed during the war, but if you didn't knit or sew, the Red Cross had workshops. See the different results from the same instructions for eye bandages? The workshops help standardize things. The Red Cross also asked women on the home front to make quilts, like this one, to be used by soldiers in hospitals. They needed pillowcases, sheets, and hospital garments too. Folks also sold comfort kits to be filled with things soldiers carried with them, like sewing kits, mirrors, shaving equipment, and handkerchiefs. The governor's single brother, Hal, used this room whenever he was in town, and that was quite often. This brass bed was one of two used by the Stewarts when they lived here. Unfortunately, though, when the two twin beds were being moved back into the house in the 1970s, someone thought we were disposing of them and took one home. It may be out there somewhere. Have you seen our twin? Being First Lady didn't mean Mrs. Stewart stopped sewing all their own clothes, sometimes with the help of a local seamstress, Miss Polly. This was the billiards room in 1888, but made a great space for the women to sew while the children played. During World War I, many Americans saw instructions in magazines for signature quilts to raise money for the Red Cross. A fundraising quilt in Cascade County raised over $1,000 for the Red Cross.
I think we could all save a little bit more if we bought a whole bolt of fabric and it all went together, and then we could take what we needed from it, because I'm going to need several more yards for this quilt. I don't know. What do you think of that? But then a teacher, and teachers do those things. White thread on red, but soon it will disappear. Incredibly unique brown thread on here. But then, you know, it is wartime, so we just don't know if we're going to have white thread or brown thread or something other than that.
Towards the end of the war, the Spanish flu broke out. When Matilda Mannix finished her nurse's training, instead of serving over there, she was needed to help flu victims in eastern Montana. Montana was the fourth hardest hit state. People wore flu masks in the hopes it would prevent the contagious disease from spreading. The youngest Stewart daughter, Leah, did catch the flu, but thankfully recovered. Many little girls wish they were old enough to be nurses too. The doll and buggy belonged to the Stewart girls, and they can prove it. That's Big Sister Emily's haircut trimmings made into the doll's wig. Well, this is the last stop on the tour of the original Governor's Mansion. We hope you enjoyed your visit and you can come again sometime. If you'd like to see the mansion again or learn more about it, you can go to our website at montanahistoricalsociety.org.
Private Tuck is a funny little codger with a smile, a funny smile. 5 feet none, he's an awful little dodger with a smile, a funny smile. The short road, he'll have his little show, he can't be so pressed. All the other fellas have to grin when he gets this off his chest. Hey! Pack all your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. While you've a Lucifer to light your bag, smile, boys, that's a smile. What's the use of worrying? It never was worthwhile. Oh, pack all your troubles in your old kit bag and smile. But yell down this little bunch is mine. Keep your head down.